Moderator for today's Hirekos webinar, The Basics of Shaft Installation. The webinar will be led by Hirekos Technical Director, Jeff Summitt. Jeff has worked in all facets of club making and repair since 1984 and has devoted the past 20 years to researching, testing, and analyzing thousands of different golf shafts. He has compiled his findings and research into the Dynamic Shaft Fitting Index, which is featured in the best-selling book, The Modern Guide to Club Making, and Total Club Fitting in the 21st Century. Additionally, he has authored the annual Dynamic Shaft Fitting Addendum, which instructs club fitters in the proper fitting and selection of shafts. Both books are available for sale online at hirekogolf.com. Your audio settings are muted, and if you look at your GoToWebinar dashboard located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see the box labeled Question. Feel free to type any questions or problems you may have throughout the webinar. Because we have limited time, we are saving the question and answer period for the end when Jeff has completed his talk. If for any reason you must leave the webinar, don't worry. It is being recorded and it will be posted on YouTube and also on our blog at blog.hirekogolf.com. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Hirekos Golf's Technical Director, Jeff Summitt.
Thank you, Rob, and thank all of you for taking the time today to attend today's webinar on the principles of shaft trimming. Are you confused on how to confidently read the shaft trimming charts? Well, in this webinar, we're going to discuss in depth the principles of shaft trimming, including the bore types, the trimming notes, cutting in between flexes, and a few different examples. Before we get started, I want to say this. Shaft trimming is not difficult as long as you pay attention and follow some basic directions. Did you ever play the game Simon Says as a kid? Well, if you didn't, or it's been a long time since you had, it's a game for 3 or more participants, most often children, and one of those players is named Simon. The other player must do what Simon tells them to do when asked, beginning with the phrase, Simon says. For example, if Simon says, tip trim the shaft 2 inches, the player must tip trim the shaft 2 inches. If a player does not do what Simon says, they're out. Or in the case of trimming shafts, they're out the money they paid when they incorrectly trim the shaft. You see, shaft manufacturers and component distributors will not warrant shafts that are not trimmed properly. However, if Simon simply said, tip trim an additional inch for the bore type without saying Simon says first, the players that do not add the additional, or the players do not add the additional tip trimming. Those players that do will be, without being told, are going to be out the money they paid for the shaft. So it's important to pay attention, especially with shafts costing upwards of $100. And the old adage, measure twice and cut once, it's an invaluable lesson even for the skilled club maker. If you build enough clubs, don't worry, you're eventually going to make some mistakes, but by following this rule, you'll reduce your losses. So why trim the shafts at all? Well, for starters, the club maker must be able to accommodate a lot of different lengths, so the manufacturers make sure there's enough length to cover the majority of golfers. If you have a golfer that's taller than, say, the average 5'10" male, the last thing you want to have to do is add an extender. Not only would this create more time in the assembly process, but more money as well. In most assemblies, you'll be trimming at least some off each and every shaft. By trimming different amounts from the shaft, the club maker controls the flex of the club, and we'll go into that in much greater detail later on. On a final note, you should never be intimidated by the process of shaft trimming and installation. These concepts and procedures are logical once you learn how to use the shaft trimming charts. Now that we've established that there's a need to trim the shaft, next we'll look at how much to trim and from where on the shaft. Before we do, let's take a quick look at the anatomy of the shaft. I want you to look on the left at a few of the diagrams. The top diagrams show a unitized parallel tip steel shaft. Okay, these two terms could be confusing And the first term is probably one you've never heard or discussed, and that is unitized. Unitized is a term describing a construction type of shaft in which one shaft can be used to build an entire set of irons, and one shaft can be used to build an entire set of woods through successive trimming of the tip section. Unitized shafts allow the club maker to reduce their inventory of raw shafts when building a set of clubs. Another term that's often used for unitized is master shaft. Now, parallel tip is a term describing a construction type of the shaft in which the tip is made to be one constant diameter up to a certain point on the shaft. Now, parallel tip diameters are typically 335 or 350 for woods and 370 for irons. In steel shafts, the tip diameter remains constant from the tip to the first step, or the knurl on the shaft. In graphite shafts, the tip diameter remains constant from the tip up to a certain point on the shaft as designed by the shaft manufacturer, and that's going to vary greatly from one manufacturer to another. Now, these two terms are not interchangeable. For example, a parallel tip rifle shafts, they're not unitized. They may be parallel, but they're not unitized. That is, the manufacturer pre-trims the shaft to a specific flex and frequency, so all you have to do is install the shafts and butt trim to length. However, they actually do start out as a master shaft. Now, taper tip is a term describing the shafts in which the tip is made to gradually increase larger in diameter from the very tip up to a specified point on the shaft. And the common tip diameter or taper tip diameter for irons is 0.355. Now, going back to the diagram, you can have both a parallel butt section and a parallel tip section, and these vary from shaft to shaft and even amongst flexes. In between these two sections, you'll see your steps, and this is what controls the rate of taper and the stiffness distribution of the shaft. That is what helps determine if the ball flight is going to be high, medium, or low. A stepless steel shaft or a graphite shaft may have these exact same features, but they're not going to